Good evening. My name is Jan Macvarish. I'm the Education and Events Director of the Free Speech Union. Welcome to tonight's Free Speech Union Speakeasy in Edinburgh. Tonight we're going to be asking the question, what do we know after the first 30 days of the Scottish Hate Crime Act? We've already been out and about testing the law by filming this afternoon with the hate monster and Toby. So I'd like to thank Rebecca Chapman and Lucas Amos, who very bravely came out with us, manned the costume, which Rebecca has so brilliantly made very, very quickly in response to the legislation coming in and that particular cartoon being published. So it was really good fun being out there on the university campus this afternoon. And Lucas was superb in his acting skills, really quite moving at times, which you wouldn't think that... You wouldn't think a furry costume could be quite so expressive, but thank you very much for that. So we've got an absolutely packed house here tonight. People online won't be able to see. We've got over 120 people, I think, in the room, and 250 people plus signed up to listen in online. We can't do the Q&A tonight with the online option, I'm afraid, 'cause it's just too complicated, but hopefully you'll still enjoy the experience. If there's any technical problems with the live stream, we'll be publishing the video in the next week, so you'll be able to watch it after the fact. So, since the 1st of April, when the Hate Crime and Public Order Act came into force in Scotland, the Free Speech Union has been inundated with hundreds of new members, and I mean hundreds and hundreds of new members, but our switchboard, such that we have, was not nearly as busy as that of Police Scotland, who in just the first 3 days since its implementation received reports of more than 3,000 hate crimes. I was very nervous about coming up here today because I really was very worried about the numerous insults that could come my way. Now, obviously, a very large number of those may well have been directed at Hamza Yousef himself, which is a bit of a glitch in the legislation. But the numbers have since come down a little bit, but we can talk more about that during the discussion. But it's not just the Scots that have been paying close attention to this particular piece of legislation. Free speech supporters in the rest of the UK and internationally are watching very closely, anxious to learn how to resist attempts to adopt this kind of legislation and similarly draconian measures elsewhere. You may have noticed that Joe Rogan had something to say about it, Elon Musk had something to say about it, and even Ali McCoist had something to say about it. So as usual, we have an expert panel here tonight to enlighten us and to answer your questions. So first of all, I'm going to introduce them, and then we're going to have some discussion amongst ourselves, and I'll ask them plenty of questions to kick us off. And then, as usual, we'll come out to the floor, and there'll be plenty of time, taking us up to 9 o'clock for Q&A, for you to answer all your questions on the Act and what comes next, most importantly. So, first of all, I'd like to introduce David McKie. David is a senior partner in the law firm Levy McRae. He's been involved in some of the most significant cases in Scotland in the last 25 years, including representing Joanna Cherry in the case involving the Stand Comedy Club last summer, and acting for the women's group Filia, who successfully challenged the Glasgow venue, the Platform, when they threatened to stop their pre-booked event, I think it was over a year ago now?
No, it was less than 6 months ago.
Oh, 6 months ago, okay. He's got vast experience in almost all forms of litigation, including police investigations, criminal cases, civil disputes, and all forms of inquiries, public, parliamentary, and fatal accident inquiries. He also represented Alex Salmond in his action against the government, and also in
you beat them.
He also advises many of the major media companies in the UK in print, broadcast, and online, and was head of media law at the University of Glasgow for 10 years. He's authored books, legal articles, and is a regular commentator on legal issues in the media. So can we welcome David? And you'll probably recognise our next guest, Murdo Fraser. He's a Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party politician who has represented the Mid-Scotland and Fife regions since 2001, speaking for the party on business, economy and tourism. Most relevant to tonight, though, he threatened legal action against Police Scotland after discovering that a social media post, which I'll ask him to explain later, in which he criticised Scottish Government, had been formally recorded as a non-crime hate incident without his knowledge. Before politics, Murdo grew up in Inverness, attended Inverness Royal Academy. He went on to train in law at the University of Aberdeen before becoming a solicitor. So can we welcome Murdo? And last but not least, you'll definitely recognise Toby Young, who is the founder and general secretary of the Free Speech Union. I'm sure all of you know, we're a non-partisan mass membership public interest body, standing up for the interests of our members, many of whom from Scotland are in the room tonight. Also, plenty of people who are not members who are here, hopefully, to witness us for the first time in action. If you'd like to join the Free Speech Union, you can do so really easily by the end of the evening by talking to me or any of my colleagues. So Toby co-founded 4 schools and a multi-academy trust in West London. He served as a Fulbright Commissioner and is the author of 4 books, the best known of which is How to Lose Friends and Alienate People, which was published back in 2001, which surely prepared the ground for cancel culture. He's also an associate editor of The Spectator, where he's written a column since 1998, and is editor-in-chief of the Daily Sceptic. So let's welcome Toby. Okay, so I want to start with David as the practicing lawyer in the room. So I wanted to ask you just to explain the Act itself. Just tell us in a nutshell, if it's possible, what it is that's new about this Act.
Lawyers explaining things in a nutshell usually takes about 25 minutes.
Tiny
so I'll
nutshell.
do my best. Very difficult. What I would say actually as a lawyer is 2 or 3 things. First of all, it would almost be more interesting to have this discussion 10 years' time, because when legislation's new, it's very difficult to know how it's going to be applied. But the headline is that the criminal offence, the new criminal offence of this legislation is to do with stirring up hatred. So what does that mean? What it actually means, it relates to 2 types of different characteristics. So one's race, and the other is a number of other characteristics, which I'll come on to in just a minute. The offence involves a person behaving in a manner that a reasonable person would consider to be threatening, abusive, or insulting. Okay? Now, threatening and abusive behaviour is quite common and has been known to be an offence for many years, and is a new branch of a breach of the peace, which was a common law offence. And I happen to be of the view that there was nothing wrong with actually common law offences being used by the courts rather than Parliament legislating every 5 minutes on new pieces of legislation. So there's one immediate concern about legislation. But the word that sticks out to me there that's new is insulting. What does that mean? So so behaviour in an insulting way, or communicating to another person in those 3 same ways: threatening, abusive, or insulting. So what that relates to, my interpretation of that is going to come down to social media. And the first is behaviour. The very concerning thing, just looking at some of the guidance notes, is that this behaviour includes behaviour sitting at a dinner table in your house. So you may all have views of that. I'm actually just here to say what I understand the law is and what's going to apply. I'm not really going to offer views necessarily. I'll leave that to our experts to my left. But from a legal perspective, those are the words that I'm looking at, and words are very important as a lawyer to look at. Okay, so those 2 things need to be in play. First of all, is threatening, abusive, or insulting behaviour, and they have to either, did I just split my infinitive there? Intend to stir up hatred. So there needs to be what we lawyers call mens rea, intention, very important principle of law, or an objective standard. A reasonable person would consider the behaviour or the communication to be likely to result in hatred being stirred up against such a group. So the first category is race. The second category are a number of different characteristics. That's age, disability, religion, sexual orientation, transgender identity, and variations in sex characteristics. The latter 2 are newer, but these are all characteristics which have been part of hate crime legislation in Scotland now for many years. I mean, for example, last year I had a quick look before I came in. There were 5,800 or thereby police charges, cases referred to the Procurator Fiscal's office. That's the Crown Office in Scotland. So those are the offences, and the defence, which is where I think Murdo comes in, and all the opposition in Parliament. The defence is, first of all, you have a defence if you can show that the behaviour of the communication was in the particular circumstances reasonable. That's absolutely on all fours and consistent with what the law has been for many years on breach of the peace. But of particular interest is the introduction of the Article 10 of the European Convention. That's essentially freedom of speech as we know it, freedom of expression. So freedom of expression has to be taken into account, and that's where I think, as a lawyer, the likely either tension points or legal points are going to come to the fore in a court. And that, as a lawyer, is very much what I'll be focusing on if and when I have any cases that land on my desk.
And given what you know about the legislation already prior to April the 1st, what kinds of cases do you think will be the ones that are pursued? I
don't think you're going to have, we had the JK ruling post, which was am I going to get arrested when I get back in the country? I don't think that kind of thing will be. I think it will probably be very much people throwing gratuitous insults at people, possibly some vandalism, maybe football matches, that type of thing. I don't necessarily think we're going to see it coming through debate or comedy or the arts. I may be wrong about that, I don't know, but I think it's more likely to be very much at ground level, people shouting something or saying something, and possibly out of ignorance as well, which I don't know who's going to be prosecuted, but I suspect that that's more likely where the prosecutions will be.
So I was looking at the stats from the last month today, and the vast majority of those reported so far have concerned race rather than anything else. Yeah. And I thought that I saw somewhere that quite a lot of those reports are also where the victim is actually a police officer. Is that possible?
Yeah. Well, it depends, of course, on the circumstances, but race is by far the highest category of existing hate crime cases which are placed before the court. So that doesn't particularly surprise me.
Mm-hmm. But that could be references to race in any direction between any people of what might be defined as a race?
Absolutely.
Right. Okay.
So it could be English. It could be. Usually people associate race with colour, but it's not restricted to colour.
Okay. And so when this concept of the reasonable person, is that a sort of static concept? And what's that rooted in? Is that something that changes? Are we in a different... Do we agree what a reasonable person is?
Well, is a reasonable person in the 1960s different from a reasonable person now? I think the courts would say probably they would, as cultural and societal sands shift. This is quite, from a legal perspective, again, that will be very much part of what a lawyer will focus on. That's meant to be an objective standard. So me saying that I'm offended by what you said, I think Murdo will actually be in a better position because he sat through all the debates. At least I think you did. I'm assuming you did. I'm relying on you, Murdo.
A long time ago.
So I think that in terms of a reasonable person, you'll be looking at is to avoid the I'm offended by that, because once you've got the subjective, and I think that's where a lot of the crimes that are being committed, or incidents being reported to the police. We saw in the first week something like 8,000, and if I remember the statistics correctly, it was only 2 were potentially going to go forward. There was a flood right at the very beginning. I suspect an awful lot of this will arise from misunderstanding and people saying, I'm offended by that, therefore it must be a criminal offence. Mm-hmm. That's not what the law says. It's not a subjective thing. That's what that means. It's an objective standard. But where that lands with the court, we don't know yet. We'll have to see.
But even if this doesn't result in a huge number of successful prosecutions, what effect does it have, the fact that this is still on the statute books?
What do you mean by that? What effect?
Well, the fact that, already, even before the Act was implemented, people have already become accustomed to saying, you can't say that. Or when I, I know that come the Hate Crime Act, we could get locked up for this. So the fact, even if we're joking about it, the fact that we even think that you could get locked up or commit a criminal offence by saying something that offends somebody else, what effect do you think there will be if there's even if there's a massive gap between the actual number of prosecutions and the kind of cultural awareness of this act as some kind of new set of norms for Scotland?
I think a very worrying one. I think we've seen polarisation, and I think this will extend it even further. I think we've already seen the Police Federation saying that they think that police time is being unnecessarily taken up with this. In terms of the societal, I think we'll see family fallouts and breakups. People these days get phones out recording people surreptitiously all the time. We're going to have people at the dinner table saying something. I had a case once where it was somebody said something as a joke in the privacy of a house, and it ended up in court. I won't say what it was, but this was an absolutely delightful person who clearly said something as a joke. She didn't realise that she was being filmed. I was just horrified at the idea of, there's a word that we Glaswegians use, cliping. Does everybody know what that means? This cliping culture. And I just don't like it. But that's where we're now going to. So I think, do you know what cliping means? No?
I do.
Good. I'm pleased to hear it. Thank you. that I think, and
snitching for those at home and outside of
apologies. So I don't know if it's Glaswegian or Scots, right? Of course. Sorry, apologies. Forgive me. So that's my mother always used to say, "Don't clipe." And I think it's actually something that is actually something that's a positive, and seems to have been forgotten. I'm not saying people shouldn't report serious incidents happening, but I think that's the culture. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it's healthy, to be quite honest with you. So I'm now straying into giving my opinions, but I think though, as a lawyer, it is concerning. I think there's far too much legislation, and this is another example of something that arguably, and again I'll leave it to the experts, there are certain things that society can police itself that the police don't need to police, if that makes sense. And I think this, frankly, is probably going to be one of those. One of those.
And then finally, what's the view of the legal profession as far as you're aware? And what's the talk amongst lawyers?
Well, if it means lots of prosecution, there's a distinction between the legal profession, which is the Law Society, who lobbied for freedom of expression, said that vulnerable people should be protected. So there was a very balanced and objective, to use that word, submission to Parliament by the Law Society. I think lawyers, if you ask them in the bar common room what they think, half of them, or more than half, would say, what a lot of nonsense this is. But if it means lots of work for them, lawyers never like to turn that down. So there's a rather healthy and unhealthy mix, but it was ever thus.
Thank you. And moving on to you, Murdo. Could you just explain to people how you've got into trouble on this particular issue? Not everybody will know.
Okay, so start at the beginning. So back in November, so I'm a columnist on the Scotsman newspaper, and a fellow columnist of mine, Susan Talgetty, who's a journalist, wrote a column because the Scottish Government had just published a non-binary action plan, an action plan for non-binary people. And Susan had written a very good article excoriating this, basically saying this was nonsense, but it wasn't just nonsense, it was dangerous because this was a way where biological men potentially could access women and girls' spaces, so it was very dangerous. And I had shared a link to this article on Twitter. Now, those of you who follow me on Twitter, all 47,000 of you, will know that sometimes, I try and express myself a little tongue-in-cheek, shall we say. So I posted a link to this on Twitter, and I said, identifying as non-binary is equivalent or is as valid as identifying as a cat. I don't believe the Scottish Government should be spending our money producing action plans for either. So I posted that and got lots of likes and so on, and that was fine. Thought no more about it. Now, unbeknownst to me, a trans rights activist had reported my tweet to the police. And the police looked at it and decided it wasn't a hate crime. And this predates, of course, the Hate Crime Act that only came into force on the 1st of April. So they decided no crime had been committed, but in line with their policy, they would record this as a non-crime hate incident. So a record was made of this, that this complaint had been made, and that record contained the details of what I had said. And I knew nothing about this. Police did not contact me. There was no conversation. The only way I found out about it is the person who had complained then went to the Ethical Standards Commissioner, who is the person who oversees the Code of Conduct for parliamentarians, and wrote to the Ethical Standards Commissioner and said, the police have told me Mr. Fraser's guilty of a hate incident. Here's the crime reference number. I demand that you take action because he's acting in a manner that falls foul of the Code of Conduct. And the Ethical Standards Commissioner said, no, that's nonsense. He's entitled to have a political opinion. But every time a complaint is made, even if he rejects it, he writes to you and tells you about it. So I found out back in December this had happened. So I was very concerned. So at that point, I wrote to the Chief Constable and said, Dear Chief Constable, I'm astonished this has happened. This has got very serious implications for free speech. I'd like to meet you privately to discuss this. 3 months later, I got a reply to that letter, not from the Chief Constable, but from my local Chief Inspector in Perth, who confirmed that this hate incident had been recorded in line with Police Scotland policy. And at that point, I got in touch with Fraser, and we spoke to Toby, who helpfully put together a letter with Free Speech Union's in-house lawyers to challenge Police Scotland. And it was very clear that what they had done in recording this was a breach of human rights. And very helpfully, there's legal precedent on this. We have the case of Harry Miller. Harry Miller was a retired police officer in England who had posted gender-critical comments on Twitter, had had non-crime hate incidents recorded against him. He'd gone all the way to the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal had said his human rights were breached as a result of this, and he won his case. And consequent to the Miller case, which was, I think, was 2001, the police in England had changed their policy on the recording of non-crime hate incidents. The police in Scotland, because they're useless, didn't do the same. So we made a formal challenge to the police in Scotland, and we are waiting to hear back formally a response to that. Now, there is a postscript to this that makes it even more interesting, because on the 1st of April, the new Hate Crime Act came in, and thousands of complaints were made to the police, and we know that hundreds of complaints were made against two individuals. One was Jo Rowling in relation to posts she made about transgender people, and the other was, of course, Hamza Yousef. And there were hundreds of complaints made against Hamza Yousef. You might remember he made a speech in Parliament 3 or 4 years ago, ranting about everything being the colour of my shirt, white. And people, no doubt slightly mischievously, all got in touch with the police and said, we'd like to accuse Mr. Yousef of stirring up racial hatred, which is an offence under the Hate Crime Act. And the police said, we don't consider a crime has been committed. So I, through journalists, got them to ask, well, ask then how many non-crime hate incidents have been recorded against Mr. Yousef, because if the police are applying their policy, they applied in my case, you'd expect that to be a very large number. And the police came back and said, we haven't recorded any. Now, at this point, I rather threw my toys out of the pram, and I got in touch with the police. I wrote to the Deputy Chief Constable and said, this is ridiculous, I want to meet you. I then contacted the chair of the Scottish Police Authority. For those of you who don't know, so in Scotland we don't have police and crime commissioners. We have something called the Scottish Police Authority, which is whose members are appointed by, guess who, Scottish ministers. And their job is to oversee the police. So I got in touch with Martin Evans, the chair of the Scottish Police Authority, and said, this is ridiculous. Police Scotland seem to be applying a different policy in the case of Hamza Yousef, the SNP First Minister, to the policy they applied in my case as an opposition member of Parliament. this smells to me like political bias. And they went, whoa, we don't like this. So I managed to get a meeting last Thursday with the Deputy Chief Constable and with the Chair of the Scottish Police Authority to try and understand what has gone on. And I'm still not much the wiser post that meeting, but I think what's happened is on or around the 1st of April, Police Scotland changed their policy on recording non-crime hate incidents to bring it into line with the position in England. But they haven't changed their website. They haven't announced this change of policy publicly. They haven't told the Scottish Police Authority they've changed their policy. So the whole thing is a complete shambles. So we continue to pursue it. We're waiting for the formal response. But if it comes to it, we're going to have to sue them.
And what position would I was going to say normal person, I mean an ordinary person, be in to find out if they had an NCHI against them? What would be the consequence for them if they did, and what could they do about that? Because obviously they're not going to get private meetings with chief constables. So.
Well, exactly, and I'm very conscious. I'm in a very privileged position here because if I was just, Joe Punter, I could have dozens of hate incidents recorded in my name. So I tried to understand from the police exactly what this means. They said, no, if you do a subject access request, it won't come. It's not recorded against your name as the complainer. It's recorded only in the name of the person who makes the complaint. And I said, well, that's fine, but let's imagine a scenario where, say, somebody has a grudge against a school teacher, and they make lots of spurious complaints against the school teacher, say this school teacher's guilty of racism or hate crime, and the police say, well, we're not recording that as a hate crime, but in line with our policy, we'll record that as a hate incident. And that person then goes to the school board and says, your teacher, Mr. So-and-so, the police have told me he's guilty of 15 hate incidents. What's going to happen to that person's employment? So there are really serious human rights issues at the heart of this. And although there were no immediate consequences for me, you can see another scenario where people in other circumstances could face very serious consequences.
And people do seem horrified. I mean, lots of people have picked up on the fact of non-crime hate incidents, and just the non-crime bit stands out to people as being a real shift in the law. What evidence is there that public opinion is severely out of step with laws like this?
Well, most people were totally unaware that this was police. I mean, I had somebody who's sat in Parliament for more than 20 years and sat through a lot of the debates on the Hate Crime Act. I had no idea these things existed. It's only when it happened to me did I find out about it. And the police must have thousands of records of non-crime hate incidents. Everybody in this room might have hate incidents recorded in relation to things they've said or done, and we've no way of finding out. And that's got very serious implications for civil liberties.
Yeah, so we'll come on later to talk about what we can do about it and how it might be challenged through Parliament and outside of Parliament. But on to Toby. Toby, you've written, obviously a lot in the past, but also recently particularly about the fact that this isn't just a Scottish phenomenon. So, Poland, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Canada. Do you want to explain a bit more about the kind of broader context globally about how hate has become a sort of forming a new framework for law?
Yes. It's certainly Scotland is not an exception. Very similar laws are being rolled out across the world, particularly in Europe. People will probably know that there's one currently before the Irish Parliament. And even though there's been a recent change in the Taoiseach, it looks like that bill will go ahead, though it's being vigorously opposed by free speech advocacy groups in Ireland. We discovered that while Stormont wasn't sitting, the Justice Ministry of Northern Ireland were beavering away, developing their own version of the Scottish Hate Crime Act. And so now there's an oven-ready bill in Northern Ireland, which I think will be brought before Stormont now that it's been resurrected. It's very similar to the Scottish Act. the Law Commission of England and Wales literally proposed a hate crime and public order England and Wales bill in 2021, which the Conservative government seriously considered bringing forward, and the Free Speech Union and other free speech lobby groups lobbied hard against it and managed to kick it into the long grass. But I think under a Labour government, I think it would be resurrected. In some respects, it was even worse than the Scottish Hate Crime Act. It contained something called the harmful communications offence, which would have made it a crime punishable by up to 2 years in jail to say something that caused someone else serious distress. And that was included by the current Tory government in Westminster in the online safety bill, but the Free Speech Union and other groups managed to get it taken out. But I think that'll be resurrected. And actually, we like to think that we're doing better than Scotland because, you know, however restricted free speech currently is in England and Wales, it's not quite as bad as it is in Scotland. But it's worth bearing in mind that in some respects, the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Act just brought Scottish law into line with the law in England and Wales. So the only group you could be prosecuted for stirring up hatred against in Scotland until the Hate Crime Act was activated on April 1st was the only category was race. Whereas in England and Wales, it's race, sexual orientation, and religion. So it was only one protected characteristic in Scotland you could be prosecuted for stirring up hatred against people who possessed it, compared to 3 in England and Wales. But Scotland seemingly now have a habit, or the SNP government anyway, of they see something authoritarian happening in England and Wales and think we can do better. So they went further and thought 3 protected characteristics, not enough, we're going to introduce 7. They went from 1 to 7 with the Scottish Hate Crime Act, but non-crime hate incidents certainly aren't unique to Scotland. I think the concept was invented by the College of Policing, a quango set up by the coalition government. I mean, David Cameron was elected saying he was going to set fire to quangos in a bonfire of quango. In fact, he created lots more, including the College of Policing. And they introduced this concept in 2014. And we calculate that about 250,000 non-crime hate incidents have now been recorded since 2014 in England and Wales alone, which we worked out was an average of about 65 a day. I mean, you wonder why, if you get burgled or your car's broken into, the police don't come to your house. It's because they're far too busy investigating what people are saying on social media. I mean, they're not policing our streets, they're policing our tweets. It's obviously a lot easier. It's much less risky. You can do it sitting at your desk. You can even do it if you work from home. It's certainly not something that's unique to Scotland. But as Jan said, things are even worse across the Channel. In Poland, an amendment has been brought forward by a current member of the Polish cabinet to criminalise any criticism of the LGBTQIA plus community. And that, I think, will include saying gender-critical things on social media. And I think that'll be punishable by up to 2 years in jail. It looks like that'll pass. And probably the ultimate example of kind of liberal authoritarianism is Canada. There's something called the Online Safety Bill, Online Harms Bill, which is currently going through the Canadian Parliament. And that makes the Scottish Hate Crime Act look like the First Amendment. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary. If you commit a hate crime under this law in Canada, you can go to prison for life. If the authorities suspect you're going to say something hateful on social media, such as trans women aren't women, you can be placed under house arrest before you've said it. under this new law. And you'll have to produce urine samples regularly because they don't want you to kind of drink and tweet. You have to wear an ankle tag, give up your communication devices. It's like a kind of horrible hybrid of 1984 and Minority Report, but actually it's worse than Minority Report. I mean, those of you who've seen the film, I mean, at least in Minority Report, these people with extraordinary kind of these telepaths who were able to kind of see the future could warn the police who was going to commit serious crimes like murder, and the police would then arrest them before they committed the crimes. But there was some kind of due process. In Canada, you know, if they just merely suspect, if the police merely suspect you're going to, you know, say something hateful on social media, you can be placed under house arrest. I mean, it is extraordinarily draconian. What's behind it, Jan? I mean, it seems to be a way of just trying to suppress dissent for the most part from radical progressive orthodoxy. You ask people hear the phrase hate speech and they think, well, what's wrong with banning hate speech? We don't want people to be hateful. Surely we want a more pleasant place where people aren't hateful. But then the question is, well, who decides what's hateful? We went to bat for Kelly J. Keane at the Free Speech Union. She put up a petition on change.org saying she wanted the Oxford English Dictionary to keep the definition of woman as adult human female. And change.org took it down. We asked them why, and they said, well, it's hate speech. So apparently defining a woman as an adult human female is hate speech. So, you know, it's not just kind of what ordinary people think of as hate speech, which is being criminalized, you know, across the world. So yeah, it's serious, and we need to do everything to fight back against it.
Oh, and what? So, in some ways, it's easy to argue against it when it's about non-binary cats and, you know, the kind of silly end of things, and things that are novel as an insult. That we, you know, most people still have the common sense view that these things are there to be challenged, they're up for debate. But what about something like racism, which in some ways is, you know, not being racist has become a kind of shared value, you could say, across society. Is there a place for hate crime law in dealing with racism? And I'm thinking in particular now, at the moment, this is really bubbling up in a very serious way because of the Israel Gaza conflict, where you have obviously accusations flying in all directions, many of which are about stirring up, and they are about insult and about inflammation and conflagrations and people feeling unsafe in a very serious way, not in a kind of snowflake way. So what's the kind of consistent principle to apply here when it comes to challenging hate crime legislation?
Well, I think it's that's the hard argument. I think I would appeal to the principle that David mentioned earlier, which is the common law breach of the peace principle, which was essentially resiled from by the 1966 Race Relations Act. So that introduced the idea that you could be prosecuted for intending to stir up hatred. And that was a departure from the common law breach of the peace principle, which is that you could only be prevented from saying something in the public square if it was likely that your saying it would lead to a breach of the peace. Under the stirring up offences, you can be prosecuted for intending to stir up hatred, not just now against particular races, but it doesn't matter whether you actually stir up hatred and it leads to a breach of the peace or not under the current law, whereas prior to 1966, to prosecute someone for stirring up hatred, you had to show that it was likely to lead to a breach of the peace, and that standard's now been discarded, and that was the beginning, I think, of the slippery slope we're on. What is the justification for going back to that standard? I think it's that the problem with protecting particular groups and punishing crimes which are motivated by hatred for just some particular groups, or speech which is intended to stir up hatred against people who possess certain protected characteristics, is it's a departure from the principle that we should all be equal in the eyes of the law, and no particular groups deserve special legal protection. And I think that is a sacrosanct principle that we have departed from and that we need to return to. I think politically that's going to be difficult. I can't see any government repealing the Race Relations Act. And I know that Murdo has done sterling work trying to campaign for the repeal of the Scottish Hate Crime Act, but perhaps not surprisingly, when you put that motion before Holyrood a couple of weeks ago, it was only supported by Conservative MSPs. I think everyone else defended it, voted for it, apart from the Liberal Democrats who abstained. Disappointingly, even Kate Forbes voted for it. Politically, it's a challenge, but I think it probably helps that the senior Scottish politician who piloted the hate crime bill through the Scottish Parliament, who staked his reputation on that particular piece of legislation, was gone within 30 days, less than 30 days of it being enacted. I think that's helpful, and I hope that that will give Keir Starmer pause for thought before replicating that legislation in England and Wales.
So just before we come out to the floor, Murdo, what do you think can be done? I mean, and how important do you think the hate crime legislation was to the downfall of Hamza Yousef?
So, well, the downfall of Hamza Yousef was related to his stupidity. I could stop the sentence there, couldn't I? His stupidity. Well, so. The Greens and the SNP fell out over a number of issues, mainly the failure of the Scottish Government to meet its climate change targets, and secondly, the ban on puberty blockers coming in Scotland, and the Greens were very upset about this. The Greens were going to have a vote of their members as to whether to break up the coalition. Hamza thought it was a good idea to get in there ahead of them and look strong by ripping up the coalition first. So he called in the two leaders of the Greens, Patrick Harvey and Lorna Slater, at 8 o'clock in the morning and sacked them unceremoniously. Not surprisingly, they were a little bit unhappy about this. And then when we announced that morning we'd be having a vote of no confidence in Hamza Yousef, the Greens said they would back us, and that gave us a parliamentary majority. So bye-bye, Hamza. So that was really wise. So the Hate Crime Act, I suppose, was part of the mix, but wasn't directly the consequence of wasn't directly the cause of that. I think in terms of what happens next, so we did have an attempt in Parliament, as Toby said, to repeal this, which was not successful. But we were able to use the arguments, some of which we've already heard tonight, about particularly the impact on police, and both the Police Federation and the Association of Police Superintendents. So both the rank and file officers and the more senior officers were saying this is a huge burden of our time. We're having to deal with these thousands of complaints, and this takes away from other policing duties. So we had a lot of arguments on our side. Even the most senior Scottish lawyer of our generation, Lord Hope of Craighead, who was Lord Justice Clark, rose to be Deputy President of the Supreme Court. Even Lord Hope came out and said this should be scrapped. So it wasn't just us making a political comment. There were lots of other people coming out and backing us, and we didn't win. So what's going to happen now, I think, is going to take a number of cases coming to court before we really see where the courts will interpret this act. And the precedent that's really interesting is a bill or an act which was the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act, which was passed, I think, about 10 years ago, which was a clampdown again by the SNP, trying to clamp down on people singing songs at football matches that were deemed to be unpleasant. And this piece of legislation was roundly criticised by the judiciary. One sheriff famously described it as mince, in good Scots terms, mince, and it became a bit of a laughingstock. And then when the SNP lost their majority in Parliament, we managed to get all the parties together to repeal it. And I can see the Hate Crime Act going the same way. I think it will take a number of cases. It will take the courts to say, we don't believe this is good law, then eventually Parliament will catch up.
David, can I get, yeah.
I was just going to say, Toby, I don't know if you know this, but you were talking about the Race Relations Bill, and you mentioned the words. It was actually a number that is a hate crime in Scotland. That number's 1966. You're not allowed to utter that in Scotland, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Right, if you want to put your hands up, can we just start with direct questions to any member of the panel? So shortish questions would be great.
Murdo, given the authoritarian nature of the SNP and their history of passing utterly ludicrous legislation, would you agree with me that the intention of this legislation is nothing to do with the protected categories, but is to ultimately suppress and criminalise criticism of the government?
Well, that would be one interpretation, Tom. You could take, it might be an ungenerous interpretation. I actually don't think Hamza Yousef is a bad man, right? And that might be a controversial statement, but I don't think he's a bad man. He might be a stupid man, but I don't think he's a bad man. I don't actually think they set out to create a piece of bad law to silence political opponents. I think they were trying to be that word that is so misrepresented, progressive, right? And it's all part of a broader agenda from the SNP. And my apologies, there might be SNP supporters in here tonight, but the whole SNP agenda is to demonstrate that Scotland is a different cultural country to other parts of the UK. And we are a progressive nation, and you see that in terms of gender reform, you see that in terms of conversion therapy, you see that in terms of this Hate Crime Act, trying to show that our culture is different and we are prepared to take different decisions to other parts of the UK. And I think that is what this is about.
Toby, have you got a view on that?
I puzzle slightly over why what until Hamza Yousef became the leader was essentially an ethno-nationalist party embraced radical progressive ideology and turned it into what looks like a fairly toxic brew. I think Murdo's right. It's part of the SNP strategy of wanting to seem like a more progressive, more forward-looking country than the rest of the UK, not hamstrung by our history of colonialism and involvement in the slave trade and so forth. Although it did puzzle me when Hamza made his resignation speech, he sort of, in one breath, said that it was a source of immense pride that he'd been able to lead such a great country, but then couldn't help but in the next breath say that there were still deep-seated problems of structural racism in which far too many senior people in the country were white. And it's like, well, if it's a cesspit of racism, why is it such a source of pride to lead the country? Anyway, I think maybe more broadly, what is it that connects wokery-pokery with Scottish nationalism? And it seems to be a kind of chippiness, a sense of grievance, victimhood. The Scots aren't just victims of colonial oppression by the hated English. That there are also all these victims of patriarchal and cishet normative oppression as well. There's a sort of rhyming. The two kinds of victimhood rhyme and enable the SNP to kind of demonize the hated English as the source of everything toxic in our culture. I mean, there seemed to be an element of that, and it seemed to rhyme with the Kirk as well. I mean, there's a Puritan strain to radical progressive ideology, which found a purchase, I think, in Scotland's religious heritage. So there's that dimension to it too. But ultimately, it's a bit of a puzzle, and I haven't quite kind of got to the bottom of it.
Well, and also it's everywhere. Right, there was a lady here.
Thanks. I have a quick question for David. You talked about sexual variation as being an offence. It was the last one, and I don't know what that means. So, as sex isn't...
You don't know, I've got no chance.
Well-
variation in sex characteristics. I don't have a clue. But this don't expect me to know the answer to anything, but don't expect me to know the answer to how legislation is now framed in Scotland. So that perhaps maybe gives you the answer that you're perhaps looking for. I'm not sure. Murdo will know better than I do.
So this was all part of the debates at the time. Now, what was interesting, in that list of protected characteristics that's covered by the bill, the one thing that's not covered is sex. No, not gender. Somebody said gender. No, not gender, sex. Now, there was an attempt during the bill's passage to insert sex as a protected characteristic. And there was a group of Labour MSP, women, Labour MSPs, Elaine Smith, Joanne Lamont, Jenny Mara, who were very exercised by this. Joanne Lamont, former Labour leader in Scotland, very exercised by this, who ran a very strong campaign backed by a lot of feminist groups to get biological sex put in. And this was resisted by the Scottish government because they feared a conflict between putting sex as a protected characteristic and having this variation of sexual characteristics.
I'm assuming that means intersex or that kind.
Yeah,
I'm assuming.
I think that's that's what it's intended to
but
mean.
that's- yeah.
Now, so we now have the Scottish government looking at bringing in new legislation to outlaw or deal with misogyny, which would deal with the issue of hatred towards women. Curiously, nobody's cared about hatred towards men, but that's an issue for another day, perhaps. But there was an attempt to put this more broadly in the bill, and it was resisted. And again, if you think about some of the things Toby's been talking about, if you have sex as a protected characteristic, therefore stirring up hatred towards women is therefore potentially a crime. Somebody saying a trans woman is a woman is committing a hate crime. So no wonder they didn't want it in the bill.
There is potentially a misogyny bill that will be presented to Holyrood in the not too distant future, and Hamza intended to bring that forward before he fell on his sword, and he was asked whether the misogyny bill would protect trans women from misogyny, and he said, "Well, of course it would." Sorry, my Scottish accent's hopeless. So, if a misogyny bill is passed by the Scottish Parliament, it sounds like you could have a situation in which a biological woman is prosecuted for being misogynistic against a biological man.
Well, also, if this could apply around a dining room table, then we're all in trouble, I think. Right, so, yeah, we're going to...
Hello.
We're
Hi.
going to go to the chap at the back.
Yes, I'd just like members of the panel to comment on the fact that the Scottish Government has funded almost exclusively organisations like LGBT Youth Scotland and the Equality Network, which includes Scottish Trans Alliance, and other organisations like Time for Equality in Education, all of which have supported these various proposed restrictions on our freedom, and all of which would be in a position to support litigants who sought to take legal action against people who offended them. And for instance, in conversion therapy bill, there is a clause that was inserted by the convergence trans activists, if I can call them that, who were outed by Wings Over Scotland. None of them were clinicians, none of them were doctors or psychiatrists or anything of the kind. And in that clause, there is a suggestion that teenagers or children who don't get what they want from their parents, in terms of dress and name recognition, should be able to prosecute their parents with help from third-party organisations, which would be Scottish government-funded charities and activist organisations, including the ones I've listed, which in aggregate get several £1 million a year, not only from the Scottish government, but from the Police Scotland. We saw that with the J.K. Rowling, you may remember, which was put out for training material to Police Scotland, and so on. That's my question. Is that actually freedom of speech, or is it an attempt to prejudice by institutional means, because the other side of the debate would not have the resources that those organisations have from the Scottish Government? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very fair question, and you make your point almost for me. The classic example of this was the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, which was driven by the Equality Network and Scottish Trans, both of them being organisations which are charities but are 95% funded by Scottish Government. And the Scottish Government actually gave money to the Equality Network to run a campaign to change the law on gender recognition reform. When the consultation was launched, they got people to respond to the consultation. They told them what to say. They therefore built the case for it. And it was all done by taxpayers' money from the very start. Now, thank goodness, Alistair Jack, the Secretary of State, did us all a massive service by coming in with a Section 35 order and stopping the Gender Recognition Reform Bill becoming law and going for royal assent, a decision that was upheld by the Scottish courts back in the autumn, who ruled he was perfectly within his rights to do so. But you're right. The root cause of a lot of this is the government using our money as taxpayers to fund campaign groups to try and get the government to do something it already wants to do, but it needs the third party backing and credibility from a so-called charity in doing so, when that charity is simply a front for something that is government funded. So you're absolutely right.
Thank you. Right, there's a lady over the other side. Oh, yeah, okay.
Oh, well, yeah, I was sat here with my right hand up. I don't want to be Count Dankula here. So, yes, my question is, of course, there's the Scottish National Party. And as you were in England, there is such a thing as the British National Party. And the British National Party in England, as far as I'm aware, is not banned because of freedom of speech, but it is essentially pushed underground and essentially demolished to the point of pushed to the sidelines. Now, given their extreme views and the threat of actual harm to minorities and many other people that disagree with them, could there, without my views regarding Scottish independence or the SNP themselves, could there be legal grounds for banning the Scottish National Party in the ways, I'm perfectly serious, in the ways there would be a banning of the British National Party? Thank you.
From a legal perspective, this was the point I was making earlier, actually, about society being able to police itself. And the example you give is actually a very good one. In terms of the Scottish National Party, no, because that's where Article 10 comes in, about political speech. And I give examples about whether it was theatre or comedy or whatever it is, would create a defence. And that's why I think the prosecutions are much more likely going to be honest with you, probably in working class areas. People who are not particularly well educated. That sounds very patronising. I don't mean it to be that, but that's where actually I think the very people that the government purports to represent and protect will probably be the ones, I would suspect, who'll end up prosecuted. Would be my guess on it. So to answer your question, it actually arguably proves the point, which is why do we have legislation on this when society can police itself rather than legislation passed every 10 minutes?
Can I ask you a quick question, David, which is on the Police Scotland website, when the hate crime bill was activated, it said precisely that the people most likely to commit hate crimes were vulnerable, were white working class young men with a sense of male entitlement, which sounded to me like hate speech. I mean, do you think we could persuade Police Scotland to prosecute itself for breaching the Hate Crime Act?
Well, I don't know about that. I have defended many police officers who have been prosecuted. I remember actually I once defended a police officer on a religious aggravation case for singing a song that was deemed sectarian up in your hometown, actually. So in answer to your question, I'm not sure actually it would necessarily be male entitlement. I don't think it is. I think it's probably people who will feel disenfranchised and feel that they're not being heard and perhaps don't have the education or the benefits that maybe all of us in this room have had to be able to articulate something in a particular way that's more measured. And that actually is, I think we should all be concerned about that, to be quite honest with you.
It's part of the case against enacting these hate speech laws in the United States is that in those states where they have been enacted, an extraordinarily large percentage of the people prosecuted for hate speech have been homeless people. And there was, I think, a report in Scotland that the head of a homeless shelter said that he'd actually, various clients of his had had their collars felt by Police Scotland on suspicion of having committed hate crimes. I mean, the notion that they protect the most vulnerable people in our society is for the birds. It's the most vulnerable people in our society that are most likely to be prosecuted under these new laws.
Well, presumably it's those people who encounter the police, because if the police are the most reliable witnesses to a hate crime, then they'll be the ones that are most rapidly recording them and have the authority to do so. So a bit like the lesbian Nana case in England, where a girl, apparently autistic girl, who was being arrested by the police, said that one of the police officers looked like her lesbian Nana, and it looked as though then that was going to be recorded as a hate crime. So those kinds of people presumably are the most vulnerable to having these recorded against them. Okay, yes, there's where's Matt? Yeah, that lady there, and then there's a lady there.
Hello. This is maybe more a question for Murdo. There's a well-known saying, put a good person into a bad system and the system wins every time. And anyone who's studied or looked at or uses systems thinking, there's a huge amount of authors on this, will know that 96% of outcomes comes from the system and not the people. And as you said, maybe Hamza's not a bad person. I'm sort of giving him the benefit of the doubt.
Controversial opinion.
But he's not the brightest spark in the box, let's put it that way. But what is it about the system that's allowed it to be captured? Not the people, the system. There's something fundamentally wrong with our systems. And people are so quick to blame the people. And if they're only 6% of the problem, and I know the political system is highly complex, but I think we need to take a step back here and look at the system. Maybe the rest of you would like to comment, because each of your professions has a system. There are systems all around us that are giving us crap outcomes.
Well, I'll let my colleagues come in. I'll make two observations in relation to that, because I think it's a very, very valid point to make. The first is we have seen increasingly, I think, in recent times in Scotland, policy capture by vested interests, where you get legislation coming forward that is driven by a pressure group. Just as the gentleman at the back was asking the question about the likes of the Equality Network, you get activist groups pushing for reforms in social policy that are not widely shared by wider society, but because they are activists, because of their influence in government, very often because they are government funded, they are able to push for these legislative changes that don't relate to what the public want. And we saw that classically with gender recognition reform, where its advocates were saying, public opinion will catch up very quickly on this. Of course, it didn't. In fact, the opposite happened. So the second point I would say is this points to me to the need for parliamentary reform. And something else I'm doing at the moment is working on a paper on parliamentary reform, which a think tank called Reform Scotland is hopefully going to publish in the next few weeks. Our system for making laws in Scotland is fundamentally flawed. There aren't enough checks and balances in the system, and I think we need to introduce, instead of a 3-stage legislative process, a 5-stage with additional checks. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of that, it'll bore everybody, but we have too much bad law. We had the Named Person Act struck down by the courts, gender recognition struck down by the courts, incorporation of the UN Charter on the Rights of the Child, that was partly struck down by the courts. Offensive Behaviour Football Act had to be repealed. There's been too much bad law because the mechanism and the process of lawmaking is bad.
Thank you. Right. Yes, the lady here. Thank you.
Good evening, Toby. Thank you for coming back to Edinburgh. It's lovely to see you. Murdo, you've just really walked into the point I would like to make. Parliamentarians in Scotland and Holyrood spend an awful lot of time, as you've just alluded to, laws, repealing laws, adding bits on, taking bits off, going to judiciary, all of these things. This is parliamentarian time. This is time paid for by us. This is taxpayers' money. Our ferries, I couldn't get off Arran a couple of weeks ago. Our transport system, our NHS, our education, everything in Scotland is gone to hell in a handcart. And what are they banging on about is hate speech. It's unbelievable that taxpayers' money is being abused. Toby, you said it's happening around the world. That's very interesting. I didn't know that. And I would quite like to know a bit more about why that's happening. Maybe we'll get to hear. But as it stands, Murdo, and thank you for walking into that, but our money is being wasted on something we don't want. Give us our education back. Get our kids learning from the age of 5 and not at the age of 7 for the first time holding a pen. That's what's happening in Scotland. But thank you.
Thank you. The lady here with the glasses.
Thank you. So I just wanted to come to that point about it happening around the world. It does seem to me that it's happening throughout the Western world. Okay, in China, I think their kids are becoming engineers, and ours are learning about 290 genders or something like that, right? So, thank you. Tad angry. So what I'm really curious about, there's many things, but is there any beacons of light in the Western world? Are there any countries holding out and saying this is ridiculous and we're not going to do this? And can I emigrate there?
Everybody seems to be heading to Hungary at the moment. And let's just take the chap in the check shirt.
Sure. Thanks very much. How worried should we be there aren't that many young people in this room? And what's that mean for the future?
Immediately people are poking anybody young and saying, make yourselves visible. Younger, I should say. This always comes up, actually. I'm never too worried, because I have to say there's a lot of people over the age of 25. There's a lot, most people are over the age of 25 in the world. So, and we know quite a lot. And we actually, I think, just need to make sure that we instruct younger people in the ways of the world, actually, and what's common sense, what ought to be common sense. Yes, sorry, just take a few more. Any direct questions before we carry on? Is that a direct question at the back? Yeah, Fraser at the back.
Yeah, this is more directed at Toby. I've read a few of your articles in The Spectator, but I suppose it'll go to Murdo as well. One of the big theories I've kind of come up with is when the printing press was created way back, we had a big war over words then. And it just seems now that this war over words, this war over speech, is now coming around because of social media. That's been the big revelation in the past 1,000 years. In the political sense, or for you, Toby, I know you like to go more of the arty philosophical sense, which I'd love to hear, actually. Do you see this being a war of social media that the free speech has come from, or do you think it's a completely separate issue that we should maybe be worried about?
Does the panel want to directly come to that one?
Yeah, I can talk about that. Yes, I do think that the rise of social media has contributed to the censorious climate across the Western world. The prevailing attitude amongst governing elites and the elite of the legal profession, the profession I'm in, for 100 years, was what was known as the counter-speech doctrine, that the best way to counter bad speech, people lying, people saying hateful things in the public square, was not to try and silence them through the law, but to counter it with better speech. And letting them speak actually did them a disservice, because sunlight is the best disinfectant. And that was the prevailing wisdom. as enshrined in a famous Supreme Court decision in the 1920s by Justice Brandeis. He set out this counter-speech doctrine, and that was the conventional wisdom across the West until the explosion of social media. I think the twin shocks of the victory of Vote Leave in the 2016 EU referendum and Trump's victory in the 2016 presidential election created this kind of what the free speech advocate Jacob Macvarish describes as elite panic. So governing elites of a largely liberal persuasion across the West thought, crikey, we're faced with a populist revolt. What do we do about it? Well, the kind of the correct response, in my view, would have been we need to do a better job of defending globalization, of defending mass migration. We need to do a better job of defending the policies we've been implementing. We need to stand behind them. We need to set out the arguments for those policies in the public square. We've been losing that argument. We need to make the case. But instead, they decided that the reason they were losing, it wasn't about a clash of values, it wasn't about the cost of some of these policies that ordinary people were unhappy about paying. It must be because bad actors are exploiting the opportunities provided by social media to disseminate misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech and mislead these poor dupes who've been voting for these terrible policies. So the way to address this populist challenge is to try and criminalize hate speech, misinformation, disinformation. And that seems to be what's behind what in America Michael Schellenberger and Matt Taibbi describe as the censorship industrial complex, which is an international multi-billion-pound, multi-agency effort combining various international NGOs, government agencies, in some cases intelligence agencies, this huge effort, coordinated effort to criminalize any expressions of populist discontent with the agenda of the global elite. That seems to be what's behind it. It's an abandonment of the counter-speech doctrine, a return to censorship as the kind of way to address the kind of challenge to their legitimacy, their hegemony. And just to make one simple point, it didn't work in the Weimar Republic. So in the Weimar Republic, various forms of hate speech were criminalized, including anti-Semitism, as a way to combat the rise of Nazism. And it had the opposite of its intended effect. And, that was a lesson I thought we'd learned. The Barbra Streisand effect writ large. If you try and suppress criticism, dissent, populism, it only fuels it. It enables the populists to cast themselves as martyrs, as enemies of the state, champions of the people. They do it over and over again, and they win elections off the back of that platform. That is not the way to address the populist challenge, the populist threat. But for some reason, the global elite seems to have forgotten those lessons, and they're back to censorship, which is going to end badly.
Couldn't you say... couldn't you say, so people tend to say, oh, it's social media, and what they mean by that usually is that the problem of our speech is worse. We're worse at speaking, we say worse things, and we are hostile to each other. But the other way around is that it is now possible to censor us, and social media is the actual tool that exposes us to the tools of censorship, and then social media actually becomes the tool itself by banning people from those platforms. In the past, that would have meant somebody in every pub, a policeman in every pub, waiting to arrest somebody, or dishing out fines for the things that you said, and when you got drunk, the insults that you might throw at somebody. And that obviously wasn't something that was proposed particularly, I don't think, or ever implemented. Maybe it was in the Soviet Union, I'm not sure. But over here it wasn't. But actually with social media, it means that our speech is visible and it's written and it lasts, and then we can actually then be punished for it in a way that maybe wasn't possible. We weren't all producing pamphlets. We weren't all writing down our objectionable views. And the problem really is us. It's that we're the ones that the elites don't like. It's just that rather than saying we just don't like the public, they can say we don't like social media. but actually they mean us. Right, sorry about that. Okay, so where's Matt? At the back. There's a chap down here who's been waiting, and I can see hands here that I've made a note of.
Hi, I'm a consultant psychiatrist in NHS actually, and in our team today, we were speaking about kind of neo-Marxist intersectional politics and the things that Toby was mentioning just now. And I think that 2 points for us. One is that ideology has really infected the NHS big style. And also I probably think the teaching profession as well. And we're very concerned that we're not going to be able to operate within the freedom of our conscience. So we're having to monitor our speech with our patients, we're having to monitor our speech with our colleagues. And I think even more so that there's more pressure on us in public services. I don't know if other people have had that experience. The other thing that really strikes me is that no one has talked in this whole debate, and this is what we were speaking today, about patients with mental illness. So we work with groups of patients who have impulse control problems. They have personality disorders, they have neurodiversity problems. And when you have these types of mental illnesses, your ability to control the expression of your emotions is severely impaired. And my worry is just what you said tonight, is we'll have lots of people who've actually got mental illnesses who fall foul of this law. And it's going to really affect these vulnerable people, because these are the people that fall into fights in the supermarket and then, come out with things that are not helpful in relationships. And I really, really worry about our patients. And, will there be a dispensation for them? Will that be taken into account? So.
Well, it should, but a lot of people can't afford lawyers' bills. And the legal aid budget, what's happening in Scotland with the legal aid budget is now the resource of the government has gone into the Crown, the prosecution service, the state bodies. I can't compete with the Procurator Fiscal Service on salaries for first-year newly qualified lawyers. And it's the state. When I started practicing nearly 30 years ago now, the guys who were doing legal aid work were the ones driving the Jaguars. And now they struggle to make a living. Now that's just to do with state bodies. But I think there's a couple of important points. There's the patients, but there's the point about what you just made a minute ago about professional people. Now, I defend a lot of professionals who end up with professional complaints against them, often completely and utterly without substance. And I know we've had to, any professional has to deal with a professional complaint. And even although you can defend it, the mere fact of the complaint can cause an awful lot of anxiety, stress, etc. And what worries me is if we're now getting to the point where you're worried about what you're saying in a hospital, what's that going to do for people saying, do you know something? I don't want to go into that profession anymore. I'll go off and get a job in government because it'll be much easier. Because this legislation, I said I wasn't going to offer any opinions at the beginning of this. This legislation is going to have that word, a chilling effect on a lot of different areas. And I think the point you make is an absolutely pertinent one, both from the doctor or the practitioner, the nurse, and the patient.
Thank you. That is a really excellent question. Yes, okay, so I've got you down here with the blue sweater, and then chap in the red jumper, late arrival hands, and there's a chap in the grey jacket. I'll try to get to you if you can, but we are running out of time.
Okay. I think most people in this room will have come in with some awareness of the dangers that face us. And I suspect that they now feel slightly more concerned than they were before we started. And I can understand why the legislation about football was overturned, because there's a big mass of popular people and MSPs need votes, and I can see why that was overturned. But most people have no idea how many MSPs we have in Scotland, for instance. So I'm not aware of where the groundswell is going to come from that's going to stop this rot within Scotland. So I would like our three panellists to give me some sort of positive news about how we can get out of the mess that we seem to be wading through just at the minute.
Okay, thank you. So what I'll do is I'll ask you all to respond to that as your final remarks, and let's just try and whiz through everybody. So there's a lady here.
Hello. I've got a bit of a niche area question here. So I've been following quite closely what's happening in El Salvador at the moment, and it's very interesting from like a psychological standpoint. So you've got people who are heavily invested in the free movement of Bitcoin, who are now having the president there as like the poster boy of Bitcoin. And he's obviously taken quite an authoritarian move. Now, I went over there at the end of last year and saw a very different story than what was painted in the media. And a lot of things that he's doing at the moment, I've seen now people in the US are like absolutely gagging for authoritarianism. So I do find it quite interesting at the moment of just how then people from either side of the party, basically on which way the media is feeding stuff, are quite willing to look at one angle of something they agree with and then just forget about all of like their morals on like another angle. For example, he's pushed back on like gay rights. I think he's actually, I don't know if he's made it illegal yet, but you certainly couldn't be speaking about anything that the SNP is at the moment. So just from like a global standpoint and what you can see happening culturally on a different level, I just wonder if you had any sort of feedback on that as well.
Right, the chap with the red sweater.
Thanks. I think this is a fairly straightforward question for Murdo. You referred to a subject access request about whether you'd been recorded as having non-crime, being responsible for a non-crime hate incident. Was that successful? I mean, is that something that people can routinely ask for and expect to be told about from Police Scotland?
I'll just deal with that really quickly because it's a simple question. Yeah, so I submitted one on the 21st of March. They meant to come back within a calendar month. We're now on the 1st of May, it's not appeared yet. But I was told verbally by the police it will come back blank because nothing is recorded against my name.
Thank you.
Quick follow-up, if I may. Yeah. Surely that can't be in line with legislation.
No, anyone can submit a subject access request, and the authority you submit it to is supposed to respond within 1 month.
If I submit a subject access request about me, and the Police Scotland will whichever body it is has any information about me for someone else's name. Aren't we obliged to provide that information?
So people can't hear you at home if you haven't got the microphone. Sorry about that. Maybe pursue that afterwards in the bar, and we'll just try and get through the rest of it. So the chap there.
Hi there. It was such a happy day when Alistair Jack came along with his Section 35 and managed to squash the GRR. Was there nothing that Westminster could have done about this obviously terrible law?
Okay, thank you. I know this is a bit unsatisfactory, this bit of the evening, but we're just trying to make sure that you all can ask your questions and then anybody else can come and chat to you in the bar with answers. There's a chap in the blue jacket and then the chap with the hat is the last one.
Thank you. Just an observation. It's been touched on about 4 or 5 bad laws that have been made, and I'm afraid that the hate crime bill is just a kind of symptomatic of the malaise in Scottish institutions. I've watched a lot of TV, read the written press over the last month in terms of commentary from various kind of news outlets, international news outlets as well. And it's quite frankly, it's embarrassing. We're a laughing stock in terms of the land of the Enlightenment. The Hate Crime Act, yes, it's got good intent behind it, but the fact is that Hamza and J.K. Rowling were the most complained of. It's a bad law. It's quite frankly embarrassing for us.
Thank you. Okay, the chap with the cap on.
Question for David or Murdo. Am I correct in that a police constable can arrive at your door, make a charge, say under criminal justice and licensing, which has similar, almost, it's something that you can move into the hate crime with sort of threatening behaviour, or you can even be charged with a shout. All right, okay. Well, I was then going to add that the police constable could walk away with a different charge, take it to the procurator fiscal, which is the state prosecutor. And the state prosecutor, the procurator fiscal, could then decide, we'll charge you with hate crime. And you would only know when you get the letter through the door telling you to attend a hearing.
Theoretically, yes. Sorry.
So, David, if you answer that as part of your final remarks.
The police can't just turn up willy-nilly. They need to have grounds of suspicion that you've committed a criminal offence. The Procurator Fiscal wouldn't just change the offence, but the police might think that it's a statutory breach of the peace, which is what you were talking about, criminal justice licensing. And the Procurator Fiscal, which trumps the police because their lawyers will look at it and say, no, they've not got that right, but we could prosecute you for a different offence. That could theoretically happen, but that's where supposedly smart aleck lawyers like me come in and say, no, you can't do that. Okay?
Thank you, David. Is there anything else you wanted to add just to close off, or is that
Well, you wanted words of encouragement and positivity. I don't have any. No, I'm only joking. What I would say is this. I've seen legislation in an area of work that I do a lot of, and that's to do with something we in Scotland should be very proud of, which is our grouse moors. People don't like hunting, shooting, etc., but it was the pressure groups that lobbied the government to change that. And they introduced legislation which criminalised landowners 12 years ago now. Since then, and there's been a lot of brouhaha and whooping and hollering, 2 successful prosecutions. Say about the Fox Hunting Act, what happened was 1 successful prosecution in about 20 years, and that still wasn't good enough. This is the point you were making earlier. It's still not good enough. They lobbied to change the law. Now, I know these are special, unique, different cases. You might have different views on these, but in terms of positivity, what I would say is legislation here does not necessarily mean convictions. Okay? So that's the positive.
Thanks very much, David. Murdo.
Okay, I'll pick up a couple of things. So the gentleman at the back asked me about Alistair Jack intervening. The issue is the Scotland Act allows the Secretary of State to intervene where an act of the Scottish Parliament runs contrary to UK reserve law. So in the Gender Recognition Reform Act, it was able to make the argument that it fell foul of the Equality Act, and that argument was made successfully. I don't think that argument could have been made in relation to the Hate Crime Act, or maybe David's got a different view, but that decision had to be made within, I think, 28 days of the Act passing the Scottish Parliament before it went for royal assent. So even if there was a case for doing that, that opportunity has long passed. And of course, any decision that the Secretary of State takes is subject to review by the courts. So in the gender recognition case, the Sheriff Court in Edinburgh upheld his view, and the Scottish Government decided not to appeal because they realised they had no grounds for appeal. I don't think that would have been the case here, unfortunately. The last thing is, just on this point, because there is a bit of a mood, in terms of the questions, you're all going to hell in a conveyor belt. It's all terrible, isn't it? I was at, last night, on a panel at a Christian event with Kate Forbes. And this same question kind of came up about people being really concerned about attacks on free speech and legislation coming through that was taking away people's rights. And we both sort of agreed that I think in the last couple of years, I think the tide has started to turn in a positive way. And I say that in relation to a number of things. I say that in relation to Elon Musk buying Twitter has been very, very positive, and that's been a positive move for free speech. I see that in terms of the pushback there's been against certain legislation, the public reaction to this act we're talking about, the public reaction to the Gender Recognition Act. The fact that people have successfully used the law, people like Kathleen Stock, Maya for Starter. You now have campuses, have academics speaking up for free speech. You have gender-critical feminists much more vocal and getting a voice in the media. Thank God for J.K. Rowling, being prepared to use her voice on her platform to speak out, and she's in a privileged position. She's able to do that, but lead the way for other women and other people too. I look at my own kids. My kids are teenagers at school, and they are in a place, and all their peer groups are in a place. They look at all this gender stuff now, and they go, "What a lot of nonsense! What a lot of nonsense!" And all the kids in the class, who literally 2 years ago, the kids in the class all had their pronouns, and now they're like, "What's that all about? Get rid of that rubbish." I think in the last,
they're now cats.
yeah, they're now cat. Yeah, they're furries. I think that's it. But I sense that in the last couple of years, we are starting to see a bit of a movement in terms of the public mood on this, and what the courts are prepared to do. And my final point is, thank God for the Free Speech Union, prepared to take up these cases and support people. And the very last plug is, there is a crowdfunder currently open to help people like me and other people with cases under the Hate Crime Act. I think we're up to about 16 and a bit thousand, thanks to lots of generous donations. I think 500 people have donated, usually very small amounts, 10, 25 pounds and so on. So if you are able to be generous and support the crowdfunder, please do. I don't think we've had any cases yet, Fraser, to actually fight, but we might have some. So, please, if you are able to help, please help. Thank you.
Thank you, Murdo.
Yeah. Thank you, Murdo. And as David said, if it's impossible in the current Scottish Parliament to repeal the Hate Crime Act, then at least we can fight it in the courts. And it could well be that a prosecution under this new act isn't safe because it's a breach of the European Convention on Human Rights, and in particular Article 10. So that remains to be seen, but I'm optimistic that we could win that battle. But in order to win it, obviously, we need the funds to wage it, and these things can be quite expensive, and there is a crowdfunder. Our Scottish crime fighting, defence legal something, right? I can't even remember the name. What's it called? Anyway, I wanted to say something positive, but I wanted to start by saying something a bit gloomy. My fellow Spectator columnist and a director of the Free Speech Union, Douglas Murray, I was reminded earlier, recently described Scotland as the global laboratory of bad ideas. And I think we've certainly seen that with the Hate Crime Act, and we're obviously doing everything we can to campaign against that. But there are two, I think, forthcoming bills. One we've already touched on, which is the misogyny bill, whereby I think it's perfectly plausible that gender-critical feminists standing up for sex-based women's rights on social media could be prosecuted for misogyny under that bill. So that's something we need to do everything we can to fight. There's also a proposal to ban conversion therapy. That's gestating in the Scottish Parliament. The committee tasked with recommending what that bill should look like have pointed to the conversion therapy ban in the state of Victoria in Australia, which is probably the most draconian, authoritarian conversion therapy ban in the world. And so far, no parent has been prosecuted for trying to talk their child out of taking puberty blockers in the state of Victoria, but opponents of that bill think it's perfectly possible they could be under that new law. And so if a similar law is passed in Scotland, it's possible that not just health professionals like you could be prosecuted for deviating from the affirmative care approach, for asking a troubled adolescent to pause and reflect before embarking on life-changing surgery, before taking puberty blockers. It's not possible that not just possible that someone like you could be prosecuted under a conversion therapy ban for advising a confused adolescent to pause and reflect, but a parent could be prosecuted just for urging their child to pause and reflect, to seek therapy instead of just embarking on an irreversible medical pathway. So that's a real danger too. But here's the positive note. I've been really impressed by the pushback against the Hate Crime Act. The number of complaints that were submitted about Hamza's white speech, the fact that he is more complaints have been received by Police Scotland about that speech than about anything else since the Hate Crime Act was activated. And in particular, the campaigning of Scottish feminist groups has been incredibly impressive. I mean, I'm a lifelong conservative. I never expected to be making common cause and fighting alongside radical feminists. But boy, if you're in a foxhole, those are the people you want beside you. I mean, it's been incredible to watch their campaigning, their success, and I imagine they'll be at the forefront of the campaigns against the misogyny bill, paradoxically, as well as the conversion therapy ban. I'm reminded of a comment Quentin Tarantino once made. He was asked what kind of man he wanted to be, what kind of guy he wanted to be, and he said, I want to be the wrong guy. As in the guy at the end of the movie when the bad guys look at each other and say, we picked on the wrong guy. Well, if it's not too much of a stretch, Scottish feminists have shown themselves to be the wrong guy. They shouldn't have picked on them. And I think it's been amazing to see their campaigning and the success they've had in drawing attention to these issues, in making the case for a more liberal, more tolerant legal regime in the public square. So I think that's the positive note to end on. We're going to be okay because they're right behind us.
I think they might even say they're in front of us, Toby. But, right, can we give a big round of applause to our panel and thank them for giving us their time?